Hey everyone! After the grand success of the NES, Nintendo only had one thing left to do. Fuck it all up!
After the release of the NES, one new gaming console was rising in the market and had become a major competitor to Nintendo.
Sega! Holy shit, that scares me every single time.
Nintendo had a large control over the gaming market, and with the gaming market still evolving, the NES was slowly becoming more and more outdated. Gone were the days of shooting ducks. Instead, we had 16 bits and a certain blue hedgehog.
The Sega Genesis, Nintendo's worst nightmare. Whereas Nintendo had to fight against the market fatigue from the video game crash of 1983, Sega had a free pass all the way through. It was 1989, 4 years after the release of the NES, which was becoming more and more outdated. New tech was being introduced for video games, allowing for more advanced games to be made, and Sega was about to make their most advanced game of all time, Sonic the Hedgehog Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf. Yup.
Contrary to popular belief, Sonic the Hedgehog was not the first game released on the Sega Genesis. Instead, it was Arnold Palmer's Tournament Golf. The Genesis wasn't doing too well for its first couple of years, and there wasn't really a reason for it. It was just another game console. That was until 1991.
Sonic the Hedgehog, the certified cool guy of the 90s. The Sega Genesis was marketed to kids who played the NES who were now older and wanted something more adult. They didn't want the Mario machine, Mom. They wanted the fast mouse console. The Sega Genesis wasn't your grandpa's console. In June 1991, the Sega Genesis sales rose like crazy, and it was about time for Nintendo to make a comeback.
See, after the NES, Nintendo didn't just leave the gaming scene. They stuck around and took the idea from their old Game & Watch systems and transformed it into a new modern design of the Game Boy. Nintendo had full control over their handheld market of gaming, but they wanted their old position of being top of the home console market again. They had already been working on a new console, but on August 23rd, 1991, the world was going to see Nintendo's home console resurrection.
The Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Holy shit, it has shoulders now.
Football players have some competition.
Nintendo listened to the criticism of the NES, and they made the SNES, a top loader which was a major feature of the remastered NES, allowing for connectors between cartridge and console that last far longer than ever before. The console itself looked so much better. It wasn't a cinder block anymore. It was a cinder block with a... Oh god, censor that.
Sadly, the SNES wasn't doing too well at the start. Nintendo hardly did as much marketing as they did with the NES compared to the SNES. Plus, there wasn't much for casual consumers to differentiate between the classic NES and the brand new SNES. People just saw it as, oh, it's a new NES. We already have one of those. Ironically, Nintendo never learned from this mistake, with later on the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, the Wii to Wii U, and of course, the DS to 2 and 3DS.
Marketing aside, Nintendo and Sega had some serious beef with one another, fighting over consumers and having the greatest console war of all time, with Sega saying that they do what Nintendo don't. Nintendo was a classic brand while Sega was a newcomer, but Sega's larger catalog of games prior to the SNES's release made it a far better choice. It was the difference between walking through an aisle of video games and seeing so many copies of Genesis games, and only a few new SNES games. Sure, you could go pick up the SNES games and be unique, but you'd be missing out on the cool blue rabbit.
SNES sales dwindled. Nintendo simply took too long to release their new home console, and Sega had the last laugh. Sega took over, and there was nothing Nintendo could do. Nintendo just lost. Until Donkey Kong Country release. Fuck yeah!
Holy shit, 2D, 3D. Mom, get the camera. It has more than 2 animation frames. You can see its ass.
I'll always remember the day I saw Donkey Kong's ass.
This game was massive. See, what Nintendo had done was make 3D models of Donkey Kong and his other enemies alongside Diddy Kong. Then, they simply made 2D renders of all the sides of the 3D renders to make the game look more 3D. Sega had no comeback. Their Blue Whale was stuck being 2D, not a 3D model in a 2D game. The SNES ultimately pulled ahead of the Genesis and began quickly outselling. Not to mention, the Genesis was becoming over-commercialized. Too many games were being made and sold. Not to mention, some actually began preferring the slowness of Mario and DK. You got to admire the game more and effort rather than quickly speeding through an entire level. The SNES had done it. Nintendo was back on top.
Gone were the days of the fucking blue dog and his companion with two tails named Bob. Now we had Donkey motherfucking Kong. But Nintendo just kept pushing boundaries. In 1993, a year before the release of Donkey Kong Country, Nintendo also released Star Fox, another 3D game set in a 2D bound system. It was amazing, but a new age was upon us. 32 bits were now being used by Sega and were being more readily developed for other consoles. But technology was finally advanced enough to make true 3D games. Imagine what 3 whole axes of movement could do. What would that even look like?
What the fuck?
What the fuck?